and Mrs. Perkins, General Seville, Mrs. Zinni, distinguished guests, officers, soldiers, and Department of the Army civilians. It is my distinct honor to welcome you to the fourth presentation of the ARCIC Distinguished Speaker Series. The Distinguished Speaker Series invites professional commentators and academics to present on a range of topics that stimulate professional discussion and debate relative to future armed conflict. Through the vast knowledge and experience of some of the best thinkers, educators, and practitioners of history, technology, and warfare, we are afforded the unique opportunity to broaden our critical thinking and problem-solving skills. The ARCIC Distinguished Speaker Series fully supports the intent of the Army's Leader Development Program. EAPAM 350-58, the Army Leader Development Program, states, today's complex operational environment poses a wide range of possible threats under chaotic conditions. This complex environment requires leaders that can perform across the range of military operations, guided by the doctrine of mission command and operating under the ideals of the Army profession. Accordingly, it is critical that the Army focus on the strategic end of developing military and civilian leaders to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Today's guest speaker is General Tony Zinni. General Zinni was commissioned an infantry second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps in 1965. He has commanded at every level from platoon to combatant command, concluded his career as combatant commander, United States Central Command. In 2002, he was selected to serve as a special envoy for the United States to Israel and the Palestinian Authority. While serving as a special envoy, General Zinni was also an instructor of the Department of International Studies at the Virginia Military Institute. Currently, he is an instructor at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University, a public speaker, and a best-selling author. Ladies and gentlemen, before inviting General Zinni to the microphone, I would like to introduce the host of the Distinguished Speaker Series, the Director of Army Capabilities Integration Center, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, to provide a few comments about today's presentation.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Sure, thank you. Hey, well, what a privilege it is to be here with everybody, and especially a privilege to welcome General and Mrs. Zinni here with us. So on behalf of General Perkins, welcome. This is an immensely important event for us because, sir, you know, we have the opportunity here at TRADOC to help shape the future of our Army. And there's no one better to help us think clearly about the problems of future armed conflict and our Army's role operating as part of the joint team, as part of inter-organizational, we call it now, integrating all the elements of national power and multinational teams. It's a real privilege to have you here as well, to address these very grave problems I think all of us can see in the world. Just by a cursory exam of the newspaper, we can see that there are very severe challenges to national and international security. So General Zinni, as Tom has mentioned, is the ideal officer to give us his insights. And I'd like to just read one thing from his recent book. General Zinni said about strategy, we have to all think strategically, because we have to think about how we fit in what we do as an Army and what we're trying to achieve overall strategically. So General Zinni said that strategy should begin with an understanding of the world we live in. That's a lot of meaning, importance packed into one little clause there. The role we play in this world, the balancing of our tools for exercising our influence and power, the setting of global goals, the building of more viable partnerships, and the ensuring of consistency in our articulated strategy. So in that one sentence is a lot of meaning in terms of what we have to do to place what we're doing to develop the future Army in context of what we have to achieve overall as a nation, and a nation in context of operating with our international partners in an increasingly dangerous world. But before I ask General Zinni to come up and to begin his presentation and discussion with us, I want to recognize the fact that today is Military Spouses Day. Did you know that? National Military Spouses Day. And I think I can speak for everyone, at the head table for sure, that in our Army and in our military, we tend to marry above ourselves. I mean, I think that's true for all of us. And I know General Zinni would agree with me as well. So please join me in a round of applause for Debbie Zinni and for all of our military spouses.
First, let me thank you for the invitation to come here to TRADOC and take up your afternoon, and I hope impart some thoughts that might be worthwhile considering. I was at Penn State a couple of years ago, and I was talking to their ROTC unit, and a cadet asked me a question that I had to think about for a while before I answered it. He said, General, when you were the commander of U.S. Central Command, what did you view as the most important thing you had to do, the most important task you had? And after thinking about that for a while, I told him that the thing that challenged me every day, but particularly challenged me when we actually had a real-world operation going on, was the need to keep aligned the politics and the policy at one level, the strategy, the operational design, and then all the tactical parts and pieces that went under that. And I said the difficulty in that was, obviously I controlled the operational design, and I certainly influenced the tactical level and certainly controlled that through my subordinate commanders and component commanders. I inputted into the strategy, you know, from the bottom up, and I'm talking about the strategy that is above the military strategy. I have very little influence on the politics and the policy. If my civilian leaders are in the mood, they may ask a view or an opinion. I was fortunate in my time to have a great Secretary of Defense and Secretary Cohen and a fantastic Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff in Hugh Shelton, who did ask us our opinion and allowed us to have a moment to speak with the President and to those in Congress that needed to hear our voices. I want to share one thing with you. It's a note I received right after I took over command of U.S. Central Command, and it has to do with a certain individual that's in this room. I had taken over in October, and this came to me in December in a package. It was from the office of the chairman, and it said, General Zinni, General Shelton has asked that Major H.R. McMasters lead a breakfast discussion of his book, Dereliction of Duty, during the Sinks Conference on 29 January 1998. A copy of Dereliction of Duty is enclosed for your use. And it was signed by the Brigadier General, some of you may know, David Armstrong, who was the Director of Joint History. Well, if you know General Shelton at all, it's not provided for your use. You better damn well read it and come prepared when you're at the Sinks Conference. I want to tell you what happened at that Sinks Conference because it really affected, in many ways, my writing this book. When we got there, HR gave us a presentation, 17 four-stars in the room, Secretary of Defense, and I think for all of us were Vietnam veterans, we were cringing because he had gotten it right. He had described to us everything that went wrong, that we could see. And I thought about that in that maybe when you're on the battlefield, when you're fighting, even though you know there are things going on at levels above you that are wrong, you still can't see it, or you can't come to grips with it, or maybe you can't admit it. So somebody with a fresh set of eyes and obviously the military experience and brains to look at that from outside is best to critique it. After HR left, General Shelton, we were all in a round table, stood up, and those of you that know General Shelton, he's about 6'5". He slammed his fist on the table, and he pointed to HR's book, and he said, "This will never happen while I'm Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and while Secretary Cohen is Secretary of Defense." He said, "You will always have a voice here. If you disagree with administration policy, if you disagree with something I do or what the Secretary does, we make a promise to you here today." These are all the combatant commanders, the service chiefs, vice chairman. We actually had the Commandant of the Coast Guard. And he says, all 17 of you who represent the senior leadership of our United States military, we guarantee you, you will see the President, you will see the leadership in Congress. And I want to tell you, I called him on it twice in my time. And both times I was taken to the President and to the leadership of the Congress, the Speaker of the House, the the Senate and ranking member and the Senate committee chairs and of course, the senior leadership in both parties. It wasn't a pleasant experience. In some cases, in talking to people like Senator McCain, it was particularly unpleasant because the things I was opposed to, they were about to put into law. One of them was the Iraqi Liberation Act that, was going to empower Ahmed Shalabi to lead CENTCOM into war. But we managed to kill it through the administration who accepted it but never put it into play. But the point I'm trying to make is these levels, if they get out of alignment, and I saw this in Vietnam, and I saw it time and again after that, if they get out of alignment, they cause us all sorts of problems that impact all the way down to that sergeant and captain on the ground. I started out to write a very different book. And I actually started to write the very different book about 21 years ago. And it was right after I'd spent 3 tours in Somalia. And I'd been in northern Iraq with the Kurds during the first Gulf War. So from my experiences of Vietnam and those experiences, I wanted to write a book about what we needed to know at the tactical level, what we had to get right maybe at the bottom end of the operational level, that these were the things on the battlefield that were significantly different from the conventional style of fighting that maybe we trained to, but more and more was becoming the way we were going to be committed and operate in the world as the way it was shaping up. And I wanted to take my time in writing that. I spent a lot of time with people I knew, people that were well experienced, people that had a military brain I respected and admired, to try to tell this story or to bring out what we needed to do. As I began to work on it, things like obviously what I just described in reading HR's book and the discussions we had with the service chiefs and the other combatant commanders and other events began to draw me away from that level and into something different. And I want to explain some of those things that happened. We conducted, when I was the commander of U.S. Central Command, a strike on Iraq called Desert Fox. It was in December of 1998. And General Shelton's concern was that every time we hit Saddam, because he didn't cooperate with the inspectors, that he saw us coming. We obviously had to build up forces in the region in order to do it. And he asked if we could actually conduct a surprise strike the next time he didn't cooperate with the inspectors and just use in-theater forces. And I asked my Navy, Air Force guys, can we put together something like this? And they said, it'll be tough, but we can do it. So we built a 4-day bombing and TLAM missile set of attacks that were designed to hit them particularly hard. But we weren't sure with the assets we have if this could really work. Well, because everything cooperated, the weather, a holiday for that weekend in Iraq, which drew their people away from their intelligence headquarters and other places, and a tremendous amount of effective BDA that our outstanding pilots and TLAM shooters were able to gain, we had really shaken the regime. We started to get back input from several of the embassies in Baghdad of allies of ours that the administration had been particularly shaken by this attack, more so than ever before. They had never seen the lack of response and the heated rhetoric, and they seemed confused, even describing incidents of Iraqi officers with their heads in their hands sitting on the curbs right outside the intelligence headquarters we hit. And the advice we were getting is, you know, you're getting close with these strikes to maybe creating something that might have a change of regime inside the country. At the same time, I had the Kuwaitis and the Jordanians come to me saying, we are getting these kinds of reports too. And by the way, if you were to take him out, or there was to be a coup of some sort, and there was to be an implosion in this country, what are you going to do about the refugees that come pouring across the border into our country? That caused me to think about an implosion, because our war plans were based on an explosion. Saddam does something unacceptable to his neighbors or others. So now I'm looking at an implosion. Basically, the effect is the same, but that wasn't one of the triggers that set us off. And I didn't understand fully the implications of an implosion. Like all military planners, I'm focused on the Republican Guard, I'm focused on taking down the regime. We hadn't really looked at the and then what question. As a matter of fact, when I was a student at the National War College, we had Newt Gingrich come to talk to us, and he said to us at one time, you know, some of you may actually go on, believe it or not, to high position in the military, and you're going to be asked by your civilian masters to do something, conduct a military action of some sort. You have to ask them the question, and then what? Because they will not have thought past that action. And that was coming back to me in this scenario. I looked at our war plan, and you know, the war plan in terms of military planning and what we needed to do to the Iraqi military and Republican Guard in particular, taking down the regime, it was all there. And we had rehearsed it and gamed it, fully understood it. We were convinced in less than 3 weeks we could execute that part of the mission. But the then what question kept coming back to me. And I got together with my staff and I said, I want to get into the and then what question. We contacted the State Department. We contacted, obviously, senior leadership, the Joint Staff, and OSD. And we asked if we could put together some kind of conference or event or something where we can look at the aftermath of regime removal. One suggestion I received is to work with Booz Allen Hamilton, who were excellent at putting together things like this. The Booz Allen people recommended a game, not just a conference to discuss this, because they said a game forces you to make moves and make decisions. And that's how you really learn and think about what you have to do. Just talking about it is not enough. This will get you immersed into what capabilities you have, how they should be applied, and the really knotty problems that you have to deal with. We went up to Washington with my staff. The State Department was gracious enough to provide a large portion of their staff. We had the entire intelligence community there. And I got to tell you, when I heard the analysis of what was going to happen after we took down the regime, I really went pale, because no one had ever really talked about this. And as a matter of fact, later on, what we experienced once we took down the regime, everything that they had brought up in that desert crossing exercise and game took place. When I came back to my headquarters at CENTCOM in Tampa, I asked State Department and others, how about joining with me and planning another phase of this 1003 plan that we have? A second phase, an annex, an additional plan that deals with the and then what. Because I see roles for USAID, the Agriculture Department, state, I mean, you name it. We needed more than just soldiers and Marines and sailors and airmen on the ground. The answer I got was, we don't do that kind of plan. And so when I looked at my plan, I said, I have half a plan, if that. I turned to my deputy, Mike Dobson, and I said, Mike, we've got to do this plan. We've got to begin. We can't know what has to be done, but we can at least identify the problems and give some thought about who might take on these tasks. So we built a follow-on to Desert Crossing. And the follow-on was designed to at least describe the things that we anticipated and to look at what might be coming behind us, if you will, to deal with these things. You know, the issues of governance, the issues of humanitarian need, all the issues that go beyond just the first military actions to take down the regime and any threats we might have. In addition to that, when we looked at the situation we might have, and this really came out from Desert Crossing, that inside Iraq, you were going to have these rivalries, ethnic, religious rivalries. As one intelligence analyst who really knew his stuff told me, sir, this place will come apart like a cheap suitcase. And as another analyst told me, if you don't control those borders, things are going to come across those borders that you're going to have a long time in dealing with them, and you're going to regret in the long term. We decided our plan required 380,000 troops if you were going to go in. You know, you were going to have to control those borders, control that population. We were going to have to think more like we did at the end of World War II. I planned for an occupation. It's interesting, after I retired, and obviously we went into Iraq, as we were going in there, I called down the CENTCOM, I got a hold of the deputy and I said, make sure you look at Desert Crossing, because I'm looking at the troop numbers you have, you've got a big problem. The first response I got was, what is Desert Crossing? So obviously we are not very good at corporate memory or continuing on with anything. I got a call from one of my planners who was still there, and he said, sir, we're forbidden from using the O word, occupation. We have to plan for a liberation. There will be flowers in the streets, and this will be a cakewalk. Now, I use that example because going back to the book I started to write, as I did an assessment in Iraq for General Odierno and one in Afghanistan for General Allen and General Mattis, I began to realize the track I was on was the wrong track. The sergeants and the captains get it. As I went down to the villages and I went down to the forward operating bases and I watched them, and I went out on patrol with some of them, I saw they understood what they needed to do. They got a quick handle on what the situation was. Their adaptability was amazing. I was shocked to see how some of those who have been there for many tours of duty had quickly understood what the changes were and what was happening and adapted so quickly. So when I began to look at where are the problems here, I mean, all the problems that I hear coming out of this and all the problems I'm seeing. And the more and more I asked myself that question, the more and more I was moving up the chain of command and then beyond the military chain of command into the civilian leadership and the guidance and the direction and the strategy and the politics and policy and all that went into this or didn't go into this in some ways. So I changed the focus of the book. About the time I was thinking of doing that, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld was at a press conference and he was asked by a reporter, isn't this beginning to look a lot like Vietnam? And the secretary bristled at that. And he said, no. He said, no war is like the last war or any wars before it. No war is like the next war. All wars are different. And you know, something in me said, part of that may be true. But I see a lot of things, at least at that point, in 39 years in the military, where there are a lot of similarities. So the change of the focus on this book was to look primarily at the very top of our military leadership and then more focused on the civilian leadership and how we've gone about committing military forces and what we've done right and what we've done wrong. Now, any of you that have been involved in writing anything, the first thing you've got to do is build a framework. Not just an outline, but in this case, if you're going to do a comparative analysis of past conflicts, past presidential decisions, and all that sort of thing, you've got to have a framework for comparison. So I built one. I first looked at what sent us to war. What are the triggers that led us to commit forces? You know, I think those of us in the military may understand this pretty clearly, but it's amazing how most Americans think we've always gone to war because we have been wronged in some way, that something clearly threatened us. You know, history doesn't back that up. There was a Pearl Harbor and there was a 9/11. I'm currently reading Rebel Yell, you know, the life of Stonewall Jackson. And one of the things in the book that came out to me, because it's the same thing I read in the life of Ulysses S. Grant in the book The Man Who Saved the Union and several other of the generals on both sides, is those that had common experience in the Mexican-American War all felt strongly that we went to war for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't as advertised. We were making a big land grab. If you read some of the leadership's accounts, memoirs, books in the post-Caribbean era of the 20s and 30s, you heard the same thing. The big joke was, we've gone down there because it was in the best interest of United Fruit. You know, we were protecting bananas and oranges and other things down there. So what triggers us to go to war? Vietnam, my war as a young officer, you know, we sold the American people on the Turner Joy attacks, that we were in international waters and attack, which later turned out not to be true. What bothered me about Iraq was the WMD. It just so happened that right after I retired, I did some work for the CIA on Iraq WMD. And there was no evidence of an ongoing program. There was no credible evidence of an ongoing program. I'll say it a third time. There was no credible evidence of an ongoing WMD program. And yet we were going to use that as a casus belli. So the triggering event, if you get it wrong and your credibility is lost, it's tough to keep the American people's head in the game. And it's tough to sell the rationale for why you're doing this. I then looked at the second part, which is how the president and his principals analyze what they are going to have to do. Now, this is the beginning of where the military culture and this sort of civilian culture differ so greatly. And it's critically important to understand this. We in the military have a planning culture. We have a culture that requires us to analyze and plan and structure in very detailed ways. There is no template for those that come into office, our political masters, in how to do this. I went back and looked at every president that has committed forces. Only one president didn't. And every other one had done it, or at least inherited a conflict they had to deal with it, or had a crisis where they led up to the edge of it. And I looked at how they did it, particularly those in more recent times. There was no standard pattern. How do I find out what the situation is, what I need to know, what my options are? You can have presidents like Eisenhower that formed special small groups of highly intelligent people that were respected, that it was important to him, had differing opinions. For example, he had a solarium group that really was designed to talk about when and how we would use nuclear weapons. When there was a crisis and that solarium group met, Eisenhower would sit in but never ask a question or give direction. He would only take notes. And he had small groups for all possible contingencies that may come up where we may have to use some type of force. You've had other presidents that relied on individuals, the Henry Kissingers, the Brzezinskis, the Cheneys and the Rumsfelds, that really had the president's ear and sort of dominated the direction and the discussion. You've had other presidents that use their National Security Council, other presidents that use their cabinet, but there is no standard way. You had presidents that really didn't want to hear a lot of opposition. They basically bought onto a path, a direction, and they really wanted to flesh that out rather than hear, those that might counter and present reasons why that might be the right way to go. Then comes the presidential decision. And that may be something that you say, well, how much time could you spend on a presidential decision? The president just makes a decision. He picks an option. Well, it doesn't happen that way. What works on presidents' minds? President in crisis and in conflict, I can imagine what's going through the mind of President Bush after 9/11, back to Abraham Lincoln, back to all sorts of presidential decisions that may have been impacted by emotion, personal feelings, other things that are happening, fear of what's being put at risk. It was extremely interesting to read about the personal pressures that John Kennedy felt during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and still bitter at the military for the poor advice he had that led to the Bay of Pigs, untrusting in the advice he would have. Military demands being put on him by bombs away LeMay. Let's get him now while we got a nuclear advantage. Shades of Dr. Strangelove. And he's trying to prevent the whole planet from becoming a cinder. Very inexperienced. He'd been a senator for a short period of time, and this crisis was a test for somebody that, obviously the Soviets thought at that time didn't have the gravitas or the experience of an Eisenhower. One interesting little side on that is, at one point, when Kennedy first came into office, he asked Eisenhower, when in your mind did you make the decision that you would use nuclear weapons? What were the conditions that you have decided that would be the time you would do it, and under those conditions? And Eisenhower told him, never ever talk about that. Never ever discuss it, and never ever describe it. No one should ever know when the president would make that decision and under what conditions. Because if your enemy knows that, he will use it, and it will use it to his advantage. And it's interesting how that carried on from president to president to this day, where no presidents are allowed to participate or by custom in war games that involve that kind of decision making. Somebody else plays the role of the president, and that's never really discussed. So the decision is not easy. In my own experience, I remember going to Camp David to brief on an operation and conduct of a bombing campaign that we're about to begin. And it was at a time when the president was there reconciling with his wife, you know, over the Monica Lewinsky case. And so I'm sure we were very welcome as we poured in there and our helicopters landed and we got there. And leading up to this, because the media had gotten wind that we were about to do something like this, there were accusations that wagged the dog. The president will make the call to use force to distract us from the issues that he faces personally. And some of the media was saying, no, he won't. He's been too weakened by this to make a decision like this. So as we briefed to the president and then looked at him for the final decision, I could remember the president saying, well, I'm damned if I do and I'm damned if I don't. And so we did it, you know. But the thing that struck me there was what's going on in his mind right now. How much focus does he have on this? Is anything personally influenced that? Now, I don't believe it did. But you never know. I mean, the president is human, and he's got to make these ultimate decisions that lead to this. We would hope from a decision comes a strategy. All of us in the military base everything on somebody giving us a grand strategy and then maybe a more specific strategy regarding what we were about to do. What is the strategy? Because if you're going to build a military strategy and an operational design to fit it, what is it? If somebody can tell me what the strategy was in Iraq and Afghanistan, please catch me afterwards, because I didn't see it or I couldn't find it. And there's a problem with that in that that leads the senior military responsible for creating an operational design without the strategic direction and guidance. Tell me that anybody in the administration understood what coin costs. Now, I read HR's manual and I read General Petraeus' manual. Right up front, it said, to be successful, you know, it takes a hell of a lot of troops and it takes a hell of a long time. I don't think the administration ever understood they were going to invest a hell of a lot of troops and a hell of a long time in what we were going to do. Not that the design was wrong, but was it connected? And I want to go back to my cadet question, nested in a strategy. Did we have one? Now, when I looked at presidents in the past, probably the most magnificent case of really creating a strategy was at the beginning of World War II. Not days after Pearl Harbor, FDR started sitting down talking about strategic direction and strategic principles. The first of which everybody took as a cliche, but it had meaning. We will become the arsenal of democracy. And he told everybody what that means is, I've assessed that our strength is our industrial base. We will outproduce the enemy. We will give our allies the capability to do this. At the height of our industrial production, the United States of America was knocking out 4,000 tanks a month. At the height of German production, they couldn't reach 4,000 in a year. When he sent General Marshall off to meet with the Brits in Arcadia, which became the Arcadia Conference, actually a series, his direction was to form the military strategy, the piece that will fit in the overall strategy that he was designing for all the elements of power in government. And of course, Marshall, probably being our most brilliant strategist, was off there doing that. It will be Europe first. We will eventually, you know, he had to stave off Churchill and others that wanted sideshows and reestablishing the British Empire by taking parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. He was focused. He had a strategy. His direction to Eisenhower was that you follow the strategy. Don't get off the track. He knew the time he needed to build up to that. He knew the tremendous task he had. Our United States Army before that World War II was the 17th largest in the world. We ranked behind Romania. 3.5 years later, we had the largest military in the world. 3.5 years later, we went from being behind every weapon system in capability to far superior. And 3.5 years later, we had the atomic bomb. All done in 3.5 years because there was a strategy. The most remarkable thing, and the question that came to Marshall, was how did you pick your leaders? No generals in position of leadership, with one exception at the beginning of the war, were kept in those positions. Because Marshall, you know, obviously the story was about the little black book that probably never existed, but in his head it existed. And he knew that there were officers out there that could command large forces, field armies, corps, that had nothing like that experience in the beginning. He had a strategy. Part of that, obviously, was identification of the leadership necessary to do it. We've not repeated this since then. Something that's come into play since then, which is critically important, is the next step. It's the battle of the narrative, the my fellow Americans part of this. It begins with that first speech that the president gives. It gives with a series of fireside chats. My father fought in World War I in our glorious army. He was an immigrant to this country, and as soon as he got here, he got drafted and got sent back. At least he ended up in France. My brother fought in Korea. It was the 25th Division. I had cousins with the 84th, wounded at the Battle of the Bulge. Another that was with the Army Air Corps, shot up over the South Pacific. You know, the most important thing from all this is the support from back home. That narrative has to get the American people's head in the game. In a democracy, and particularly in America, you aren't going to continue this fight if you don't have them in it, supporting it, understanding it. The fireside chats that my father could listen to, he knew his president was in charge. He understood why we were doing this. He was getting us through as Americans into the tough times and the dark days of the war. The president has other audiences, not just the American people. He has the audiences of our allies. He has an audience in our enemy. Right now, because of social media, because of technology, the battle of narrative has taken on far more importance. I mean, even down in our organizations now, we have people in charge of messaging. We talk about messaging just as much as we talk about maneuvers and maneuvering fires. That has become a critical important. If we don't have that right messaging from the top, and it is incredible, you're going to lose the underpinnings and support we need to continue on. One thing Secretary Rumsfeld said was to a young Army sergeant who had asked him about why he had to go to the trash dumps in Kuwait to put armor plate on his Humvees. He said, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you want. Now, he was criticized for that being kind of harsh, but it's true. So the crisis doesn't really begin when the balloon goes up or when the action that requires you to react is suddenly presented. Your preparation counts. The Army you have, the Navy you have, the Marine Corps you have, the Air Force you have, all that counts. You know, if you haven't built the structure, if you think back in just our time in the military, think back to the way we've structured ourselves. You know, Eisenhower did not want to invest a lot of money in conventional forces. He had a budget, a federal budget, that over 50% went to national security. He believed we couldn't sustain that. We had domestic issues and domestic things that we had to get done. He was really taken on by the military. When Kennedy came in, we had adopted the two-war structure. We would be able to fight Red China and the Soviet Union at the same time and engage in nuclear warfare. And Kennedy added another part to this, the 2.5 war. He wanted to engage communists because they were using surrogate warfare, communist-inspired insurgencies to engage us, and now he wanted to create a force to deal with it at that level. All wonderful and good. We can fight and win a conventional war. We can fight and win an insurgency. And we can go to the big one and win. Very, very expensive. A structure that could not be sustained. By the end of the Cold War, when the so-called peace dividend was to take place, we dropped back to a two-major theater of war structure. This was to be Korea and either Iran or Iraq. And from that, we dropped further back. It was a fight and hold strategy. Two major theaters of war, one in which you would fight to win, another you would just hold until you could shift forces over. I remember that in my time at CENTCOM because we had to build 2 separate plans to be able to do that. And now where are we? Let's be honest. Maybe 1 major theater of war? Maybe. So whatever happens when a president is faced with a crisis, he's gone to war with the army he has. Is this going to be the kind of military force that we need? Are we looking forward in what we're building? Or are we just, you know, looking at the demands, obviously the budgetary demands and the resource demands we have now? I can tell you from my time in the defense industry, short time in there, we are closing lines down. We are down to single lines on some capability. We've always had a policy of multiple lines being open, at least 2 lines for every capability. That's not happening anymore. So even on the industrial side, we've accepted great risk. Then comes the operational design. Then it falls to the Pentagon and the military, the combatant commanders, and the service chiefs to decide how we're going to do the fight. And I would tell you one piece of advice: if you don't have a strategy, you go off and do whatever you think is best, and then that disconnect will always get you in trouble. And then it comes down to selecting who the leaders are. When I arrived in Afghanistan to do the assessment for General Allen, the first thing that hit me, and this was the 10th year of the war, we had 10 commanders in 10 years. Actually, the next year we got another commander. 10 commanders in 10 years. So I went around asking people that had been there for a while, and maybe some of the young officers at NCOs that had multiple tours, how this affected them. I ran into one National Guard Brigadier General who'd been there for quite a while. I had lunch with him. He said, this hasn't been a 10-year war. This has been 10 one-year wars. I had a young sergeant tell me it in a little differently, who had multiple tours there. He said, every one of these guys comes in, has got another good idea. And the rules of engagement change, and all of a sudden this valley has become a priority that nobody cared about before, or this type of maneuver is going to, be predominantly the way we do business. I don't remember us changing out the Eisenhowers, the Pattons, the Bradleys, the Nimitzes. What are we getting into when we change leadership? Does every 4-star that come in have another damn good idea? You bet. The people above him know that this is another damn good idea. I mean, when I went through talking to these people, what was your approach? CT light, coin light. I had all these differences. Talking down to some of the troops about some of the things that made no sense at the end. And the fire support control measures that were put in place, the authorities given to use it. I encountered one incident where the battalion fire support coordinator could not clear indirect fire on a unit that was in contact unless he went 2 levels above him to get the clearance. And of course the rationale was not to create collateral damage. Now where this didn't even make sense, beside the fact that he should have been able to clear it, and it was at the appropriate level, is that he was allowed to shoot all his direct fire weapons as much as he wanted. Now, what strikes me, indirect fire, if you know what the hell you're doing, is very focused. Direct fire goes a long way. I mean, I learned this actually as a private, and who knows where it ends up. So if your interest is in preventing collateral damage, are you really doing the best thing by limiting this? There were many things in my life I never understood. One of them was, as a young private, is when they told me, if illumination pops, stand there. Don't move. My experience, and I've been in a few firefights, and I've been hit 3 times. When that illumination goes, I'm not going to stand there. I don't care what that drill instructor told me. I'm going down. My body tells me to get down. These are the kinds of things that when I talk about the troops get it, and maybe those of us, I'm not going to say right doctrine, but those of us that maybe provide the guidance ought to think through. HR and I were talking about this coming in. The best operational design I've seen is the one that draws from the bottom, the experiences, what the troops are adapting to, what they're seeing, and incorporates it and moves it up to that level, makes decisions and designs operational plans and operational designs that fit that. You learn more from what you get from the bottom than you're going to get from inside the Beltway in some ways. And you can bring to the fight a preconceived notion that doesn't work. So you've got to be open to change. Look, in Vietnam, when we first went in, we had grand and glorious generals who had all made their bones in World War II. You know, these were guys that had fought in Europe, had fought in the Pacific. They had no clue what this war was about. It wasn't that they weren't good leaders. It wasn't that they were great generals. But very few of them, especially in the early part, got it. Those that ended up getting it were learning from the experiences that they were seeing, or later in the war, when they achieved that rank, after having been a battalion commander or a regimental or brigade commander, were seeing it on the ground and now bringing it up. So when you come in, particularly at the beginning of the fight, and you're responsible for the operational design, you've got to know what people are experiencing down there where the rubber meets the road and how that comes up. I also looked at the metrics as the way we've measured success as we've been in the fight. And whether we know we're winning or not. You know, my first tour in Vietnam, I was an advisor to Vietnamese Marines. I went to language school, I went to Army Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg. I wore their uniforms, I lived in the villages, I rarely saw another American. What used to get me is we'd be up, and they operated like the Vietnamese Airborne in all the core areas. They were the National Strike Force. They had a quartering act. We lived in the villages. But if we were operating in an area and I went into a district headquarters, I'd look at a map behind the major, lieutenant colonel, whoever was the district senior advisor, and I'd see a color-coded map that showed green areas, maybe a couple yellow areas, pacification. I'd look at that map and I'd say, I just came from there. It wasn't too pacified when I was out there. I'm sure in some measure or metric he was achieving this. When I was the J3 in Somalia, when we first went in, we thought we were going to be there for just a week or two, and it was going to be turned over to the UN, who would bolster their forces and add more forces. The UN would not touch it. As the UN special representative for the Secretary General said, this is a poisoned apple. You Americans came in, you got it. And we realized we're going to be there for a while. And as we were there, doing what we thought we needed to do, we tried to figure out how we should know if we were doing well or not, if we were succeeding. So we sent back to several of our doctrine organizations, can you give us some sort of measures, metrics we should be looking at? And a number of the doctrine centers sent us stuff they were working on. And one set of indicators, low intensity conflict indicators, I remember this manual that we got, it said monitor the weapons. If there is a weapons market, monitor that, because that will tell you if you're succeeding, especially if you have a program of weapons reduction, which we have. Now, we used to go in the streets and try to clean up the markets that sold these things. We would confiscate weapons. I had a report from one of our CI teams. He said the price of an AK-47 now in Mogadishu has gone to $100. Somebody stood up and said, that's good. The price has gone up, which means it's harder to get them. Somebody else said, maybe the demand has gone up and they're willing to pay $100 because the security situation sucks. Well, which is it? And to me, that was a metaphor for the metrics that we use. You know, I hate to say this, but when I came back into Somalia, when I got called back to go see General Adi to get Warrant Officer Durant out and go to his hideout, when I first arrived at the UN bunker, and because they were getting mortared, and I went inside and I saw our senior leader in there, and I looked behind his head on a map on the wall. It was deja vu. The entire country was green, and he was living in a bunker that was sandbagged in. I mean, it does not compute. So the metrics and understanding what's going on becomes another problem. Lastly, I looked at the outcomes of the conflicts. You know, there are conflicts we may have thought we won that turned out later that you could bring into question. You know, we still have troops in Germany. We still have troops in Japan. We still have troops in South Korea. You know, if you looked at Charlie Wilson's war in Afghanistan, we succeeded in our goal. We drove out the Soviets from Afghanistan. We ended up with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. I got called to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee the month before we went into Iraq. And I was voicing my concerns at that hearing. And one of the senators said to me, "I don't get it, General. What can be worse than Saddam Hussein? If we take him out, it's got to be all good. What's the downside of this?" And I said, "General, remember, we said that about Afghanistan. We had with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. There can be something worse than, yes, he's a dictator. Yes, he treats some of his people terribly. We got him in a box. We do it with less troops and report to the Pentagon every day. I know I was a CENTCOM commander. Less than 23,000 troops in all of the CENTCOM AOR. The containment was paid for. The Saudis, Kuwaitis, and others paid for our containment forces. It was under UN authority that we did this, so we had the legitimacy. And we had the resolutions that backed up and gave us, international support for what we did. And the guy was no threat to anybody. Be careful what you wish for, because the outcome, although you may not realize it right now, can lead to something worse. So let me sum this up. I think we in the military understand our business very well. I think we in the military understand how we've got to take on a task. But I think it was General Petraeus said, you can't shoot your way to victory. And I would sort of paraphrase that a little bit differently. You can't throw this all on the back of the military without having a strategy, without having that decision-making process, without having thought through all the things I've tried to describe here. You can't go into the fight betting on the tactics to get you through and putting it on the troops' back. One of the things I saw in Iraq and Afghanistan that began on my first meetings, the first days I was there in Iraq and went to General Odierno's morning briefs, I said to him at one point, "Ray, if I closed my eyes, I would not know I'm in a military operations center." And he kind of bolted back a little bit and said, "Why is that?" I says, "Listen to what you're briefing." They were briefing the date palm harvest because they were providing pesticides and monitoring the agricultural programs. They were briefing, and I forget the names of these cells that were working with the tribal and religious leaders to mend fences, doing mediation work. They were running these museums, recreational swimming pools. When I was in Afghanistan and went there, good old HR was heading up the task force on corruption, right? And I'm sure that's based on your education experience. It was so vast in that.
It was anti-corruption.
It was anti-corruption. Now I get it. The PRTs were 80% uniformed military, and that wasn't counting security, because I asked for the numbers when I was there. So we now have become peacekeepers, humanitarian workers, mediators, you name it. My son, who did 3 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq, was a company commander in Afghanistan when they went to take Marja. And he called me up and he said, we've seized Marja, we still have a lot of fighting going on. He said, "I've just been told I got an additional duty. I'm the battalion's non-kinetic officer." And I said, "What the hell is that?" "You're an infantry officer." He says, "I don't know. I'm supposed to work with the tribal chiefs and I'm not sure what." He said, "Maybe agriculture or some other things." I said, "Well, last time I checked, you majored in football in college. You're an infantry officer, so what do you know about this stuff?" "No, but we'll take on any mission. We are Mikey. We will do it. We'll eat it. And, we don't have the other elements of the so-called soft power we need that's supposed to marry with our hard power. We do it both." So if we don't get serious about the top end of this business, we're going to continue on doing this. Only we will continue it with less resources and less recognition that it's being taken on. So I'll be glad to take any questions and comments you might have. And thank you very much again for the invitation to come down. Yes, sir.
Hello, General Zinni. I'm Drew Langfeld with the Security Systems Training Field Activities, part of the Trade Act. You had mentioned about triggering events and WMDs, and that while you were in Iraq, there was no credible evidence of an ongoing program. Is that what you stated
I'm saying after I had retired and did the work with CIA,
Yes, sir.
there certainly was WMD at the beginning when we first sent the inspectors in.
Yes,
I'm
sir.
talking about a credible, ongoing program right before he went in.
But when you went in, you
No,
said there was-
well, I went in after that. This was as we went in March of 2002.
Roger that. Question for you. Have you had the opportunity to speak with Secretary of State Powell regarding his presentation to the UN before we entered Iraq? And if so, were you able to get a feel for how he felt after having made that presentation in hindsight and retrospect?
Actually, I was working for Secretary Powell at the time. I was doing the Israeli-Palestinian mediation process. I never talked to him directly about that. I know in his book he wrote that was the worst day of his life. I do know at that time, because I was at State Department, that he was going over to CIA, and many of the things they wanted him to say, he was discounting or challenging. I do know that, and obviously this is from my experience with the CIA and getting the classified briefings, that much of what was put out there was discounted. The yellow cake, the aluminum tubes, curveball, you know, we knew those weren't credible. By definition, there was no credible evidence because he didn't find anything. And by definition, the inspectors were in, thanks to Secretary Powell and Resolution 1444 before that got Hans Blix and Mohammed al-Baradei back in. And if you know anything about those inspection teams, we had a lot of Americans on those teams. Some of them were, let me put it this way, very knowledgeable about what went on in there. And they were coming out saying, there's nothing here, before we even went in.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Others? Questions, comments? Yes,
Sir,
sir.
Major Ryan Ford from Army Experimentation. Your book talks a lot about civilian leaders and how we need to try and ensure they've got the proper strategic education. What can we as a society do to better educate our civilian strategic leaders so that we can better shape the spirit of us? Thank you.
Great question. You know, I want to go back to the beginning of my talk about, and talk a little bit about General Shelton. General Shelton felt very strongly that we, the senior leadership in the military, had a responsibility for this education. You couldn't guarantee that people were going to take it on board, but he wanted to be sure that we presented everything they needed to know, even if you got a little bit into their business of the grand strategy and the direction and the policy making and everything else. He always required us, when we briefed the president or we briefed on operational issues up the line, that we go through excruciating detail on explaining risk, as an example. Make sure they understand the risk involved. Make sure they understand in detail how this mission is going to go down. Make sure they understand in detail how you, as the executor of this, combatant commander, understands the task. Just one short story. I went in to brief President Clinton on a mission, and I was told, keep it short, just give them the basics. And this was a very complicated mission, and I felt I couldn't do that. I took in the Master Air Attack Plan, rolled it out on the table. There were actually some people who tried to grab it off the table, saying you can't give the president all that detail, he doesn't need it. And we were about to determine it by body weight, but the president came in and said, the president said, let him talk, let him talk. And the president put on his glasses, and I said, Mr. President, this is a lot of detail. It's a huge matrix. I'm not trying to tell you that you need to understand all this in that level of detail. But there are decision points here that you clearly need to understand. Because, for example, you have to give me the order to execute 24 hours before the first bomb hits or the first TLAM impacts. Why? Because I've got to get ships into position, AWACS up. I mean, all the things you have to do to get set for this. Once you give me the order to go, you can't stop it for 6 hours before it impacts. I actually had somebody challenging me on that. You can't tell the president he can't stop it. I said, well, there's no pilot in the TLAM, and so I can't call it back. You also have to understand if you spin me up and you spin me down, after about 3 cycles, there has to be a 48-hour break. And I gave him all the reasons why. Because I didn't want the president to go in believing he could do things or make decisions on things that didn't understand what was involved. And this was, I thought, the greatest part of his reaction. He took off his glasses and he looked at me and he said, let me repeat back to you everything I think you've told me and I've heard. And of course he had it. It was perfect. And to me, that was the kind of interchange I think General Shelton wanted us to accomplish, so that they understood what was going to happen, how it was going to happen, where the limitations may be, you know, and where the risk may be greatest. I got a call from a successor of mine at CENTCOM who said, I need to talk to you. He said, I'm being told to plan for a potential military action against Iran. You know, obviously if it became necessary because of the development of nukes or nuclear capability. And he said, the frustration I'm having is the civilian leadership talks about military actions. And he said, they don't understand what this involves and what it could involve. And I told him, I said, you have to describe this in terms of capabilities, not assumptions. The flowers in the streets, the cakewalk that we were going to have, as administration people were talking about in Iraq, those were assumptions, not based on capabilities or facts that may interfere with your ability to accomplish your mission. I said, you have to describe that this enemy gets a vote. If you run an airstrike to hit some potential nuclear facilities, what might he do? He's got a set of Shahab missiles. He's got Shahab 3 working on Generation 4. They're mobile, hard to take out. Are you going to try to take them all out at the same time? You're going to build up a force to do that? It's got fast patrol boats and get out with cruise missiles. Hard to pick up on radar. You might get them all eventually, but God knows what damage they could do. He's got the ability to shoot a missile into 5th Fleet headquarters in Manama or into a Saudi oil field. He's got dhows running around the Strait of Hormuz that have mines on them, which he can kick overboard. If it hits a tanker, even scratches the paint, watch the economy go in the toilet, because we're all interdependently tied. It doesn't matter how much dependency or independency we have on Middle East oil. He has sleeper cells around the world. And by the way, if you're going to do this and run this sort of quick strike and over, that sounds very sanitary, is not considering those second and third order potential effects and responses. What are you going to do and tell our allies if you decide to start bringing in Aegis cruisers, Patriot batteries? They're going to look around and say, why are you doing this? And how many of those do you have to defend my installations and me, since you're going to be operating from this side of the Gulf? And by the way, if you do all that, you're going to be signaling you're about to do it. These are the kinds of things bright-eyed 20-something-year-old think tankers need to understand when they present their one-page white paper on how to conduct this mission and what the impact might be. Because those of us that have been in uniform, these are the things we know, but to go to what General Shelton had emphasized to us, these are the things we've got to impart to those above us who don't think in these terms and realize these things. So the short answer to your question is educate at every opportunity. When the balloon's about to go up, the senior leadership wearing uniforms has a responsibility to go through it in detail. I never briefed a mission on a bunch of small number of PowerPoint slides. I went through the whole system, from the orientation all the way down to the situation, the mission, how we were going to execute, all the way down to the logistics, communication, everything else we've been taught since second lieutenants. You know, obviously on a grander scale for them, but, you know, and many times there were the yawns of, do we need all this? And the answer is yes, you need all this. Now, I was fortunate in my time to have a secretary and a president and a chairman that put a lot of emphasis on that and wanted that. You know, I can remember when Khobar Towers was hit, just before I got there as a deputy in CENTCOM, and eventually, after a while, it was determined the Iranians were responsible, based on Louis Freeh, the former director of the FBI's investigation. I got called up then, by that time I was the commander, I got called up to Washington to brief the Iranian plan. sticker shock, man, on what this was going to take and how long if we were going to do this. Because I took them all the way through to regime removal. You know, and there might have been those that said, well, we only want to go this far. The other guy gets a vote on how far you go. The and then what question. So if he responds and you have to counter-respond, this could take you all the way, 0 to 60. And you need to explain all that. So somebody that has an airy-fairy thought that may be sitting in our Congress or elsewhere, that we just drop a few bombs on Iran and we end the problem, don't understand what this could lead to. And it could lead to, you know, putting boots on the ground, which is a dirty term right now, because people don't understand what ground forces bring you. This is the other problem we have. You know, we were talking about this before we came in, General Perkins and I, about not understanding that sometimes not only does ground force give you the ability to control people and terrain, as we all know, ground forces can shorten the war. If you look at General Schwarzkopf's plan in the first Gulf War, we ended that war in a matter of hours because we followed the Powell and Weinberger doctrines, overwhelming force. You know, that's what's expected of Americans. If we don't have that overwhelming force or the will to use it, we're not going to be respected, and we're going to end up with what they fear, more casualties and being tied down longer. Iraq could have been resolved in a short term if the 380,000 troops would have been put in, if the 3 core level organizations that we had in the original plan were used. The heavy corps up the middle to Baghdad, the Marine Amphibious, the Marine Expeditionary Unit and the Brits from Basra up along the borders with Iran, and then the 18th Airborne Corps out along the borders with Jordan and up into the Kurdish areas. That place would have been frozen in a heartbeat. And we would have controlled the population. We wouldn't have had the looting. We'd have had those borders under control. We would have kept that population separated and then put in a commander that had a voice to determine what kind of system of governance that we were going to see, at least in the interim, until they could get their act together, instead of letting them sort it out themselves and ending up with the mess we did. Yes, sir.
Sir, Dan Sushman from CDLD. My question becomes, we talked before about the need to educate our civilian leadership. I'm wondering what your opinion is on the need for us to be educated on other agencies. Do you think there are points where we have either made false assumptions or have unrealistic expectations about what other elements of national power bring to the fight? For example, you mentioned governance and our need to do it. And, you know, the State Department, they don't have the capabilities or the resources to bring people over and do that. And they're ambassadors, not governors and administrators, and it's incumbent upon us to take those responsibilities. So I guess, are we making false assumptions, and what's incumbent upon us to do?
This has been a topic that has been debated, argued, you know, reams of paper produced out of think tanks, is how do we get to a balance of the kinds of power that we need on the ground. It's not only to fix a security situation, but it's a political situation, economic situation, and often a social situation. You know, I was on a policy advisory group that was formed by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when Senator Lugar was the chairman and then Senator Biden was the ranking member. Every one of the senators on that committee, Senator Dodd and Senator Reid and a number of others, were really interested in how do we develop this full range of capabilities? How do we get, you know, more of the soft power into play? And we had representatives from the military. I was the only representative from the military side. We had representatives from State Department, AID, and others in there. And their recommended fixes were all had to do with give me more money and give me more people. And I can remember Senator Curry saying, if that's the best answer I'm going to get, I don't want to hear it. Because I have a gut feeling it involves more than just people and money. Now that's part of it. Obviously they need to be bigger to embrace all these missions and have the ability to deal with it. There's a cultural difference they have to deal with it. One of it goes back to what I said before. We're a crazy planning organization, the United States military. We plan for everything. They plan for nothing. You know, they'll throw some little ad hoc group up and claim it. You know, the Office of Stability and Reconstruction or whatever, which will disappear in a heartbeat and has a couple of throwaways in a back office somewhere at Foggy Bottom. You know, that's not planning, and we know it. There's not a process that connects with us. There's not a set of plans that work together. I made some recommendations that were not too popular. One actually, when Secretary Albright was Secretary of the State, I asked her why if she would consider moving her regional bureaus, you know, the Assistant Secretary in charge of Middle East and, you know, South Asia Pacific, co-locate them with the combatant commanders, and let's get our geography lined up with each other. That would be a start. The second recommendation I made was take civil affairs out of Special Operations Command, along with PSYOPs. Doesn't make sense in SOCOM. And create a unified or sub-unified command. The difference would be, it would be an interagency command. It would answer both the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State. It would have representatives from State Department, AID, Agriculture, EPA, you know, everybody else you think you could need there, Border Patrol. And it would be in an organization that had responsibility for the administration, for the deployability, the logistics, the transportation, the teaming, and the planning. You know, so when you have a Korean War plan, this organization would build up the annex or the part that deals with the aftermath. When I say aftermath, I don't mean it's necessarily sequential, because it's going to start as soon as you cross the line of departure. And they would be able to deploy the teams we need. They would exercise. They would train. We could build within the State Department and others, much like what we have in our reserve components. People that, you know, you might be a professor at Michigan State, but your expertise is in Middle East economies. You sign up, you get paid like we do a reservist. We can do virtual exercises on computers. You can come to a place where we exercise and we rehearse how we might deploy and be used in this. And you commit and contract in the same way. It's not the military trying to tell the State Department what to do, because operationally they would be controlled by their departments and agencies. This is to get the coordination, get them locked in, and get a consistent, cohesive planning capability. Now, I actually proposed this, and the then Secretary of State, who may soon be the President, did not like it and sent some professor out to attack the idea. My answer was, you got a better one? You know, I'm willing to listen, because this doesn't work in what we have now. And this constant pointing back to some three-man office in the State Department doesn't get it. And unless we fix it, we're going to be a one-punch fighter. What happens when we leave? We leave a mighty security assistance program. Big bucks. FMS, FMF, you know, we are going to have a huge security assistance program everywhere we put our footprint. Will we leave a government that's responsible? Will we leave an economic system that's viable? Will we change social programs, you know, that need to bring people into modernity? Not necessarily, but we'll leave you a hell of an army so that the next dictator really has something he could use. You know, so that's the aftermath when you're not balanced like this and when we go in. Okay, any others, or the hook? Oh.
Sir, Colonel Tom Meyer from Capabilities Development. You provide a lot of great insights on the challenges we've faced over the past many years. I'm curious about what your thoughts are on the significant trends, threats, challenges that we have to face in the future, particularly in the deeper future, since that's what our business is. And what do you see are the most significant capabilities we need to work on to answer those threats and challenges?
Right. Let me begin by telling you about, you know, a little bit about how I see what's driving the world now and into the future. The first thing to think about is globalization. Globalization has now made us inextricably linked with every part of the world. There's no part of the world that isn't important. You know, because 10, 15 years ago, if somebody were talking about Somalia or Yemen or places like that, that significance becomes important. And that's because of the information systems, it's because of our ability to move around the world. So globalization is the first factor you have to consider. How does that impact us? First of all, we have to stop thinking regionally. This idea of pivoting to the Pacific was the worst thing I ever heard. You know, my question is, Mr. President, how's that working for you so far? You know, and you shift the carrier around, you dump some Marines in Darwin, Australia. What have you changed in terms of the equation there? And where are you buried? What wakes you up at night? And where's your biggest concern? You know, the Middle East, and you're not going to be able to extract yourself. Europe, you know, rising tensions with Russia, Eastern Europe and the potential tensions there, the need to reconstruct NATO, which has become woefully inept, in my view, excuse me, General, but you know, we need to fix NATO. You know, dumping more countries into NATO was not the answer. We have not kept up with the military spending and capability we need there. Our own border, what happens south of us is significant in many ways. So my first point is to think globally. When you think globally, you realize it's not about places. I saw a briefing on China, and the briefer set up a map of China. All of us know from our high school geography, yep, that's China, I recognize it. Well then, he started talking about China's energy dependency, and he kind of put some tentacles on the next overlay. He then talked about where China's political influence is growing. He then talked about China's markets, and he went on and on. Pretty soon, you couldn't see the geography. The Westphalian concept of a nation state is eroding. It's different now. We have borderless considerations, and the world is tied together in different ways. There are 5 domains we better worry about. One is space, the other cyberspace, the other are major sea lanes of communication, air routes of communication, and this one's very important for you here, and people don't get it. There are land points out there that are globally critical. One of them is obviously in the Ukraine and in the Baltic states that are going to be a critical area that we have to figure out how to deal with. You know, and there are choke points and places where this criticality has global impact. We need to think about access, control, potential denial, you know, and how we're going to deal with these. This is the global thinking. That's the first part of this. The second part is to think about things that are not on our radar. We have environmental issues that are going to come back to bite us. Health issues that come back to bite us. You know, we deployed to, you know, for the Ebola scare. You know, I'm not a tree hugger, but I was on a study that looked at the impact of global warming. And, you know, for those that deny it, I would just show you a picture of Greenland 15 years ago and Greenland today. What does that mean? Well, when a scientist tells me it's a 3-foot rise in sea level, and that means maybe Bangladesh goes away. Then you ask, we were 11 of us 4 stars on this study, what does that mean in your part of the world? What does it mean if a glacier melts and that was a water source for a country? What does it mean if the climate changes from temperate to tropical in terms of health issues, agricultural issues? All these have security implications that we had better understand clearly. We have diasporas going on around the world that are changing identities. Europe is really up in arms about this. We have our own issues on, you know, in immigration, but of course nowhere near like that. We can see what's happening in terms of changing identities and the friction that might cause and the problems that might cause. Failed and incapable states, which used to be backwater issues that we didn't worry about. Now we do worry about. How do we manage the future Somalias that we may encounter? So, I mean, the picture of the world is all out there. I've got another pitch that goes through about 12 of these major dynamics that we had better understand that are like this and can take you down to what it means for us in the military, and particularly down to your service even. And these are the things I think you got to pitch in terms of making the case for the kind of structure we need, because these issues are not definable in the kinds of traditional order of battle ways we used to think about threats. So you have to be more creative about how we apply our strongest element of power to these things. And there are certainly ways we're relevant in this, more so than any other element of power. So I think we have to think a little bit differently about the future in the globe, and more in global terms than in regional terms.
Hey, so I got to tell you, you couldn't have come here at a better time, not to just Friday afternoon. But we, Training and Doctrine Command, is sort of the future thinkers for the Army, and then working closely with the Joint Force. Have been really trying to come to grips with a lot of things that you talked about, and to have someone of your experience and stature to come here that has served our country from second lieutenant to combatant command from Vietnam all the way through there, and then now in a different phase of life, continuing to serve our nation. First of all, it's inspiring for those of us to see someone who is so committed to our nation and to our way of life, and understands the criticality of having people that dedicate themselves to that and can articulate things in a meaningful way that resonates with people that need to hear that. You know, but as I said, the timing couldn't be better. In fact, HR and I and some others this morning spent some time with a senior official from the Office of Secretary of Defense talking about the future and strategies, not plans to do things, but strategies to gain capabilities. And HR and I try to continually, gently remind them that there are these silver bullet solutions eventually lead to what then. So now they may have not listened to HR and I, but now we can re-engage and say, well, you know what HR and I said? Then we had General Zinni come, and what he told us was this. And so now they may pay attention. But as a small token of our appreciation, not only here we serve as HR. Go ahead, HR. Thank you.
Sir, you know, you've been obviously a great leader as a Marine, but to our joint force, and there's so many Army soldiers and civilians, those gathered here among them, who have great admiration for you. And so, General Perkins and I wanted to present you with a small token of our appreciation of the pictorial history of our Army. Thank you, sir.
One short story, because it affects you here at TRADOC. It says a lot about who you are. When I first went out to East Africa when I was part of CENTCOM, I met a couple of the generals in Ethiopia and Eritrea that fought the 25-year war. One of them, General Shabaki, was head of the military in Eritrea. I loved his stories about, you know, being in the bush, as he said, and fighting all the time for 25 years. And I said, well, what was it like? What did you like to do? He said, every year we got a copy of 100-5, and we sat by the fire and we read it and debated it. That's what we look forward to. I wish it would have been an FFF, but no.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for participating in the Distinguished Speaker Series. General Zinni, thank you for your comments. General Perkins as well, and General McMaster, and Mrs. McMaster as well. Thank you very much. And also to thank AUSA for hosting this event. And I would like to share an invitation with the rest of you to join our seniors off to this direction afterwards for some refreshments from AUSA. So again, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Have a great weekend, everybody. And thank Don Lisenby over there.